The history of international relations is quite important, and it's something that can still be useful to us to understand the way that states and governments interact today. There's a well-known quote: "Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it," and that's a quote that can be taken into consideration with international relations as well. So the earliest precursor to what we today would call international relations would have to be the interactions between tribes. So initially, the earliest form of international relations, you could almost call it proto-international relations if you want to use that terminology, would be tribes contacting one another and in order to engage in things like trade or perhaps quarrels over territories or things of that nature. Another society that was well known for being on the early side of international relations was one of the earliest documents is the Treaty of Kadesh. So the Treaty of Kadesh was the treaty that stopped the Egyptian-Hittite War. So the Egyptian-Hittite War, this document is renowned for a few instances. It's one of the earliest examples of a peace treaty that we can find. And it's also an early example of the lingua franca, the common language of the common parlance of the time was Akkadian, which was the native tongue of neither the Egyptians nor the Hittites. But because it was something of a lingua franca, that was the language that this particular document was written in. So this is the early examples of both of these particular topics. International relations really started to take something of a early Proterozoic focus in the form of Greeks. So the Greeks had a number of things that we still use today. There were an early form of ambassadors, which were at the time called messengers. And we can see this actually in the case of Hermes, who is the messenger god. So obviously the fact that they had a god illustrates that it is something that is quite important to them culturally and was quite important to them culturally. They had a number of rules that they used to dictate both foreign conflicts as well as domestically. And these are things we can still find in international relations today. There were also the Byzantines who had groups of delegates that they would send out to other countries. These delegates' main goal were to get people to trade with the Byzantines or to buy Byzantine wares, and these were beneficial. This is something, of course, that we still see today regarding the way that states interact with one another and trade with one another on an economic standpoint. This is an early example of states trading resources and trading information and also attempting to strike up alliances. The Byzantines were one of the earliest examples of this. Another earlier example of this was China. China decided to do things a little differently. The way that China actually did things was by making it so that they figured that if their society was one that was truly worthy of emulation, they would be able to attract foreigners to their countries by being a country that is worthy of admiration and is a country that people want to go to. This was a particular way of doing things that was a little bit different from other powerful nations at the time, and it is something that maybe not everyone used, and it ended up being eschewed a little bit by some of the other countries that were well known regarding in politics. Rome is another country that is significant with regards to the history of international relations. They took a lot of what they ended up doing from the Greeks. They regarding delegates. They also had established archives, and they had a whole written and judicial system, and these were things that carried over into international relations as well. And so they had these instances here where they took a lot from the Greeks because of their close proximity and the interactions they would have in nature and throughout history. Talking a little bit more about recent history, when you go back to 1500, you will see something that you could argue still pretty much shapes the world today, essentially, and that is the period of European hegemony. In the 1500s, the European states started to get a little bit more colonial, started to get a little bit more imperial, and this had the end result of allowing them to take a large number of resources from other countries and cultures, and sort of put those other countries and cultures down. And this led to other influential periods in history, such as the Age of Enlightenment. And obviously, these periods were important from a historical standpoint in terms of both culturally, what it did for things like the arts, literature, and so forth, and also militarily and technology-wise. And this is something that essentially is still part of the status quo today, because when you look at the world today, the two of the biggest powers are the United States, which is a country that was originally comprised of Europeans, and Russia, which is also heavily influenced by ideas from the Enlightenment. And so this is something that is carried over. But the idea of the state first really started to take place in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 and 80 Years' War, and it established things such as the concept of a state, sovereignty of that state and its people, and is essentially the main framework for a lot of modern theory regarding international relations, and is a huge stone for international relations and the interworkings of it today. And these are just a few of the examples of how you can observe the history of international relations and how it can be applied today.